How do you turn this into this? I did this project in January for a health clinic that needed to have this small rack moved on the wall from this low location to a higher location so that it would be out of the way and they could use the room for other things. It was just an absolute eyesore, an absolute rat's nest of wires. Here's the thing. I actually installed this 20 years ago. Now, of course, when I installed it, it wasn't a rat's nest of wires. It was these patch panels, these blue wires, and these SMC 10100 switches, which at the time were good enough to service this health clinic. Every one of these blue wires were mapped to their proper place up here. So we had 24 port switches. And so we were using all of these right here would be patch panel 1, patch panel 2, patch panel 3. But you can see that, man, there's just a lot of jankiness going on here. Stuff's been moved. We've got a lot of extra wires that have been plugged in here. This is just absolute overkill for the customer situation. And now with wireless in their building, this is just an absolute mess, and it doesn't need to exist this way anymore. So what I did was, first of all, I told the customer, well, I can move this rack, but here's what's going to happen. These old switches, I mean, these things could die anytime. I don't know. They could stay alive, but they are old technology. They are 10100 switches. Everything today should at least be using gigabit switches. So I let the customer know that. And since you can see just so few lights here, there's no need to go with, 3 switches in here. We could really do this with one 24 port switch. That would be plenty to service them for a while. That will also give them extra room in the rack if they ever need to add another switch down the road. But it's so important to make sure that their infrastructure is working properly. So that was the deal with the switches here and the network rack. And let's jump over to this one. So here is the HP Easy On switch that I asked them to replace with. I gave them the specs. I gave them a link. I said, here, this is what you want to do. Get this thing. I'll set it up for you. Now, luckily, this was a flat network, meaning they didn't really have a lot of VLANs or didn't have any VLANs or anything like that configured. They don't have any local server. It's basically just so that they can get out to the internet. They do have wireless access point that you can't see here. I recommended going with a PoE switch in case they ever extend that network and need to be able to service other parts of the building with this wireless network in the future. If the signal ever fails, then using PoE on here will allow us to power up those access points without any issue. It gives them the ability to upgrade down the road. Now you'll notice I took all of those blue wires, I unplugged them. I plugged in these little pigtail wires. They're really just, I don't know, a foot or 18 inches maybe. I think they're just a foot. Long wires, and I had a bunch of these left over from a previous project, and I actually left them all the spares. So you can't see it in here, but on the top of this switch, I've got a bunch of those pigtail wires in here as spares. If they ever need to wire up another jack, then they should be ready to go. Now, you notice on the back here, there are some loosey-goosey wires back here. I wasn't crazy about leaving it this way. I would have rather at least had a faceplate to cover that. You can't actually see it from the floor, though. And the reason that this is a mess back here is just because over time, there was other stuff that had been shoved in here and plugged in back here. And it was without just pulling and repunching them onto the patch panel, which was going to take a lot of extra time and was really kind of overkill since everything worked that needed to work. Now, one thing about this project, which I think is actually the coolest, is that they came to me and said, hey, we're going to do this at night. We're going to make sure everything works by the next morning. We can't have stuff down when we come back into the clinic. And so I'm, all right, let's get her done. So I went through every jack and I used a tester to make sure that there was, if it had a connection, that it was actually plugged in. It would be easier to unplug something that shouldn't be plugged in than it would be to try and find something, find a cable, find the port, and talk them through that because I was only going to be in town for a limited amount of time and I wanted to get this project done. So the cool thing was this. The next day, I followed up with your team, no issues. Everything was working perfect, no problems at all. So I moved the rack. I got rid of a bunch of extra wire. I got rid of the SMC switches. I said, throw them in the dumpster and basically moved all of this and made it nice and tidy for them. They absolutely were thrilled with the project. Um, Sometimes when we go back to projects that are olds that we've done, and we scratch our heads, we're like, why did I do it this way? Why did I do it that way? And you have to realize that at the time the project went in, gigabit switches were more expensive. So this was like early 2000s, like I don't know, it was probably somewhere between 2001, 2003-ish, somewhere in there. So over 20 years old, those SMC switches were running, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. But I hope that that maybe this inspires you to take one of your old projects and revamp it, clean it up, make it look nice and neat and tidy again, and never be afraid to go back to an old job that you've done in the past and rework it to make it much better. All right. I hope that you find this helpful. Have a great day.